So we all make the distinction between thinkers and doers, and this is a distinction that I have made and acceptance of which I myself have urged in these podcasts. And, the obvious thing to say is that people like Donald Trump are doers, which he obviously is, and which such people are, and to say that professors are thinkers, not doers. Well, I beg to differ with the second part, or at least I believe that it is in need of serious reconsideration. I think that there are three categories, okay, three relevant categories. There are doers, okay, there are thinkers, and then there are simply people who are not doers, and they aren't really thinkers either, but it's easier to impersonate, at least for these people, it's kind of easy to impersonate being a thinker, because what does being a thinker mean, at least in this particular context, in the context in question? Well, it means becoming familiar with some rather static body of information, knowing a few talking points, being able to respond in a behavioristically acceptable manner. It doesn't really mean being a thinker. And a long time ago, when I was in college, and I was discussing how bitterly disappointed I was because I went to this eminent university and I was expecting all of my professors to be these geniuses, and that is not what they turned out to be. Some turned out to be pretty capable, but on the whole, they were a disappointment in a couple of different ways. But I was not alone in feeling this way. In fact, I don't really know of anyone, with a few qualified exceptions, who felt otherwise. I mean, there were, people in the physics who were majoring in physics who were happy with certain of their professors. But on the whole, people at this institution, and it was a pretty prestigious one, it's now ranked number 3 in the country or some such. They were underwhelmed with the professors. Anyway, this friend of mine said, well, I get the feeling that a lot of these professors are not actually smart. They're just kind of people who were last to be picked for the softball team when they were kids. And that is how I feel. There are some who are smart. There are some. But on the whole, being a professor is not really about being smart. It's just about not being a doer. And, if you happen to have some intelligence, then, and having intelligence is very different from being a thinker. But if you happen to have some intelligence, you can kind of fall back on that. You can not be a doer, and then use the intelligence that you have to kind of absorb, the rudiments of some discipline, learn the talking points, and in that way kind of simulate being a thinker. And then you can, you have your office and you have the position, and you can certainly affect some of the mannerisms. But such people, first of all, are not that smart by any stretch of the imagination. And the second thing is, even to the extent that they are smart, they're not thinkers. They're just kind of there. And what really struck me during my long journey through academia as student, grad student, assistant professor, fellow, I was involved in every conceivable way. And what really struck me was the absence of curiosity on the part of most professors. Not all, okay, but most. And I certainly understand, pettiness and things like that. I mean, that's certainly understandable, and I don't claim to be above any of that myself. But where I was very markedly different from my fellow professors was that they had no interest in anyone outside of their own department. I was boundlessly interested in people outside of my department. Boundlessly, just endlessly. And when I spoke with such people, and they always were happy to speak with me because I was interested in them, as I am interested in all people, but especially them. I mean, they were smart. Professors are significantly above average in terms of intelligence. That is true. They're not brilliant, at least not as often as they would like to believe themselves to be, but they are not dumb. And if you ask them the right questions, they will give you good answers, more or less. Although generally, actually, curiously, if you ask them questions about their field, they don't give you good answers, because then they give you politically driven answers. But if you ask them questions that are not directly about their field, but are kind of a little bit to the right or the left of their field, then they will give you good answers. Because then they can use the intelligence or the authoritativeness that they've developed in their field, but they're not stymied by all of the deeply tiresome political pressures that to which they're otherwise subject. In any case, but so when I was talking with these people, so there was this gentleman across the hall from me who was in anthropology. They would mention, he mentioned that nobody from the philosophy department ever asked him anything. Or if they did, they asked him about some uncle of his who was a kind of semi-famous philosopher. But I was just appalled. And it turns out, when I say turns out, that's not really the right term. I'd already known this, but in all of my decades in academia, I had never really seen any interest on the part of professors really in anything, except for very, very domain-specific things. And the thing is that when people are really interested in what they are doing, when they're very interested in the narrow thing that they are doing, they tend to be interested in other things. And that suggests to me that they weren't really all that interested in what they were doing, or that their interest in it was not pure. And that is consistent, for reasons that are not really worth spelling out, but it's consistent with the thesis that most of these people were not really thinkers. They were just kind of last to be picked for the softball team people who were more intelligent than most last to be picked for the softball team people, but who, at the end of the day, were just people who were last to be picked for the softball team. They were not really thinkers. And there is a difference between being of above average intelligence and being a thinker. To some extent, it's just quantitative, as in being a thinker involves being really, really above average intelligence. But that's not all it involves. It involves something else, a characterological thing. And perhaps what it involves is something that doers have. So what the people who are really thinkers are actually kind of crypto doers. They're people for whom thought is not just an escape, it is a form of action. And I think maybe that's what's going on. To the extent that these people were thinkers, their thought was escapist in nature, whereas for the people who are really, really thinkers, thought for them is just a different and alternative form of action. So, Donald Trump is buying and selling hotels or whatever. Well, a real thinker is performing comparable operations, but on statements or statement sets or some such. What most of these people were doing, with extremely rare exceptions, most of whom I actually found at the junior college level, curiously, not at the actual college level, but with very rare exceptions, these people were just phoning it in. They were not really thinkers. It was something else. They were something else, something inferior, far worse. Not just inferior, but something not real. And it was, I suppose, more or less what Nietzsche said. They were just kind of geeks who had been last to be picked for the softball team, and what they were about was not discovering knowledge. They were about protecting themselves with titles and snobisms from, the ravages, the well-deserved, ravages and taunts of their schoolmates in the schoolyard.